Hi everyone, welcome to channel Qtomation. In today's session we will see about some more important terms like use case, test scenario, test case, RTM, test suite, etc. So what are these common terminologies which we often hear or often use during the testing? So let's see one by one. What is use case? Use case is high level description of how a user interacts to a system to achieve a specific goal. So in short way, use case is basically a requirement. So whenever a new feature comes, what is the behavior when the user interact with the system? Since it's a new feature, there would be some new behavior. To achieve that specific outcome, how the user will interact with that feature, that comes under the requirement, and it is called as an use case. Use case, who writes the use case? So product owner or business person, business analyst or product person, they will write the use case. They will write the requirement. Use cases are written in simple language and outline the expected behavior of the system. So every use case will have some outcome, expected behavior. Use cases are written by product owner in requirement document. So whoever is writing that FRS document, functional requirement document, or it can be a user story, it can be a business requirement document. So different terminologies can be used, but just a common understanding is it's a basically requirement document which is written by product owner, and it defines the use cases. Use cases, there can be multiple use cases as well. So depending on the user action, there would be a different type of use cases which are written inside the requirement document. What are the different component of use case? So the product owner, whenever he write the use case, there are some components we have to understand. Actors. What is actor in the use case? Actor is basically just understand as a end user, or it can be a system as well, that interact with the system. So let's take a simple requirement of login. Who is the actor for login? A user. End user would be acting as actor. So end user is an actor. He will perform certain actions. So he will enter correct username, correct password, and press on login button. So actor, who is the end user, who is going to perform the action. And what is the outcome? Outcome will be successful login. If the same user enters the incorrect credentials, then unsuccessful login. So login will not be happening in invalid credentials. So end user is an actor here. A requirement is of login. End user is actor. So who the actor is basically entity which can be a system as well that interact with the system. Preconditions. So for every use case, there can be some conditions that must be true before the use case can start. So let's say there is a use case of adding an item in the cart of e-commerce website. So to add the item in the cart, what is the prerequisite? First, user should be logged in, that product should be available. So these are the preconditions for that use case. Actions. The normal and successful sequence of events for the use case. Just I explained earlier. So if the actor performs certain actions, it can be entering the data, clicking some button, etc. Actions is basically a sequential actions which are done by sequential steps which are done by the actor in that use case. Alternate flow. The variations in the main flow based on different input or different conditions. Just I explained earlier. So if the user enters the correct login credentials, he will be logged in and he will be redirected to some page in the system after login. But if the same actor perform the same action but with invalid credentials. If he enters incorrect password or incorrect username, he will have displayed some error message. That is another flow now. So this is called as an alternate flow. This is a variation in the main flow based on different input or conditions. Exceptions: situations where the system may fail to achieve the goal due to errors. Those comes under the exceptions. And the outcome: after performing the action, what is the expected outcome we are getting, right? The state of system after the use case has been completed. So once that use case is completed, then what is the outcome? These are the different components of use case. And who write those use cases? The product person or business analyst write these use cases. So use cases are nothing but requirement. What the new feature will be there, that new feature, how it is supposed to behave, how it should have the expected outcome, what is the expected outcome. All these things comes under the use case. And who writes the use case? Product person write the use cases. Let's take a simple example of use case. Just we have already explained, user login into the system. User will enter username and password. System verifies the credentials and system grants access to the user dashboard. This comes under the actions. Who is the actor? End user is actor. So every use case we have some actor. In this situation, actor is the end user. These are the actions. And what is the outcome? User is logged into the system and he can access the dashboard. That is the outcome of that use case. So this is the simple example of use case. And there can be a use case diagram as well. So sometimes whenever the product person write the use cases in the functional requirement document, they can write in the paragraph as well, or they can simply provide some diagrams as well. So diagrams, if you see, they are easy to understand. So you remember clearly the diagram, right? So sometimes visuals are very appealing for the use cases diagram as well. So let's take a simple example of this use case diagram where there is a actor. Two actors are there. If you see, student is a actor, teacher is actor, and these are the different use cases. So what is the student? Student can check attendance, student can check timetable, student can check test score. So these are the use case which are applicable to student actor. And what teacher can do? Teacher can check attendance, teacher can check timetable, teacher can check test score, teacher can update the attendance, teacher can update the score as well. So these are the actions or these are the use cases which are applicable to teacher, right? If you see, teacher use cases are more and he can access all these use cases. But student is limited to these three use cases only. Student cannot update attendance and student cannot update the score. Student can check attendance, he can check timetable, he can check the test score. So this is very easy to understand, right? So depending which actor is having the view, which use case, that is very clear from this use case diagram. So product person sometimes they will give you such use cases diagram in the requirements as well. So as a tester, it is very important. You should go through this use cases diagram. You should go through the functional requirement document to understand it. And in case if you have any doubt, you should clarify with product person. Then comes test scenario. We have seen what is use case. Now let's see what is test scenario. A test scenario is high level description of what needs to be tested in a specific functionality. So from use cases we derive the scenario. Simple use case can be login. So if you see, this is a use case, example use case of login. And from this login use case, there can be a multiple scenarios. Every use case can have single or multiple scenarios. Scenario means what we are going to test. In login functionality, in login use case, we will see valid login, invalid login, different type of user role login, etc. So one use case can have multiple scenarios. A scenario is high level description of what need to be tested in a specific functionality. It provides a single action or series of action to validate a feature or aspect of the application, ensuring that end-to-end functionality works as expected. Test scenarios are often derived from use cases. So in functional requirement document, you will get all the use cases. We have to go through all the use cases. We have to understand the use cases, and then we have to derive the scenarios from that use cases. We should write some scenarios from the use cases. So each use case can have multiple scenarios. Scenario means what we are going to test. Scenario means what we are going to test in that specific use case. What are the characteristics of test scenario? Test scenario focuses on a particular functionality or feature. So let's say if we have some e-commerce application, what are the different use cases in that? Login is a use case. Registration of user is use case. Searching a product is a use case. Adding a product in a cart is a use case. And what are the scenarios from these use cases? So login use case will have invalid login, valid login, different role login. What is the registration use case will have? Different type of combinations of various form elements, registration of different type of users. So this will come under the scenarios. Scenarios will focus on particular functionality or the feature. It is broad and does not specify the detailed steps. Scenarios are very short. They don't define all the detailed steps in it. Scenario is just high level functionality which we are going to test. It represents a user's interaction with the application. So example test scenario is, let's say login. So login is use case. For that login use case, we can verify validating a successful login with valid credentials. Let's say invalid credentials. So all these are scenarios for login function. So that is the difference between use case and test case. Functional requirement document will have multiple use cases. From each use case, we have to derive the scenarios, and from each test scenario, we are going to derive some test cases. That is the next part. What is test case? Test case is detailed set of actions, inputs, conditions, and expected results used to verify that a particular feature or functionality is working correctly. So test case means how we are going to test. So what to test is test scenario, and how to test that scenario, what steps we have to follow to test that scenario, what is the expected outcome, what is the actual result, what is the status, all this data comes under the test case. Test case means step by step guide to perform. So we have to perform certain steps to perform, to check the expected outcome, to check the actual behavior. That comes under the test case. So test case is basically a detailed document. We will see what is exactly test case template as well. But just understand, test case is detailed step-by-step guide to test that scenario. And test case have different type of information. So what information we should keep in our test cases? What are the different components of test cases? So when you are going to write a test cases, so every scenario can have multiple test cases. So each test case should have some ID. Test case ID is unique identifier for the test case. Test scenario, the high level scenario being tested. So if you are going to test the login scenario, in login scenario there can be multiple test cases. Login with correct username and correct password. Invalid login. So incorrect username and incorrect password. Incorrect username and correct password. Correct username but incorrect password. So different combinations are there. So these are the different test cases for valid login and invalid login scenarios. So that is the scenario. So for which scenario we are writing that test case, that also we have to mention in our test case document. Preconditions. So before executing the test case, what is some Prerequisite. What is some setup or conditions that must be met before executing the test? So you have one test case in which you are adding a product into a cart. But to add a product into a cart, what is the prerequisite? That product should be available. If the product is not available, how you are going to add the product in the cart? So that is called as a precondition. So before that specific test case, if there are any certain conditions which should be satisfied, those information comes under the preconditions column. We can write all these test cases document in Excel sheet as well, that I am going to show you in some time. But just understand different content of test case. Test steps. Test steps means a detailed sequence of actions or inputs to perform. So if you are going to perform the test case of valid login, what are the different steps to perform the valid login? So you will write the test steps in detailed manner. So first step is visit www.abc.com. Login page will be displayed. Then second step will be enter correct username. Third step will be enter correct password. Fourth step will be click on login button. So these are the different steps. So we have to write these steps to perform that test case. That is called as a test steps. Test data, a data input required for the test case. So let's say you are going to perform the valid login. So for that valid login username and valid login password should be available. That is called as a test data. Test data is nothing but the input required for that test. So whatever input is required for that test case, that is called as a test data. Expected result. So whenever you perform this test step, what is the expected behavior or the outcome of the system after performing the steps? So whenever you will perform these steps, what is the requirement? What is the expected outcome? What should be the behavior when you perform this step? So that comes under the expected result. And expected result or expected behavior, we can get it from functional requirement document. So that document will have this information. Actual result. Actual result means what is the actual behavior or outcome that is observed during the testing. So this information we don't fill in advance. This information we will get after testing the steps. Expected result we will put in advance. So expected result we know. In requirement it is mentioned. This is the expected result. But what is the actual result when we are performing the test case? So when you are going to perform the test case, some outcome will come. That is the actual result. Now that actual result, whatever it is coming, that we have to put in that column. And it is used during the execution. So after execution only you will understand what is the actual result. Now that actual result can be different as well. It is not necessary that actual result will be same as expected result. If the expected result and actual result both are matching, that means that test case is pass. If those are not matching, that means the test case is fail. So that comes under the status of test case. So whenever you write the status depending on the actual result, if expected and actual result both are matching, that means test case is pass. If actual result is different, then that test case is fail. So that comes after the execution. So after the test execution, we will know the actual result and then we have to compare that with expected result. And to test case will be pass if both the results are matching, and test case will be fail if the actual result is not matching with the expected outcome. That might be some issue as well. So this is all about the test case content. So this is the different information, or these are basically columns. So whenever you write the test cases, you should create some Excel sheet, and in that Excel sheet all this information will be presented in the form of column. So test case ID will be one column, test scenario will be one column, preconditions will be one column, and so on. So these are the basic details which need to be present in test case document. And again, the template might vary depending on the project or depending on your organization, but most of the templates will contain this basic information. One sample example test case. So test case ID. Test case ID is like this, TC001. This is the test case ID. Then we have to mention the test scenario. Validate successful login with valid credential. This is a test scenario. What is the precondition? User is already logged in. User is on login page. So what is the precondition for login? User should be on login page. Then we have to enter the test steps. What are the test steps? Enter a valid username, enter a valid password, click on login button. So these are the steps or the sequential actions which user has to do to perform this test case. Test data. Test data. What is the test data we need? What is the input data we need? It can be a username with valid user and valid password as well. That is the test data. What is the expected result? So once you perform these steps with this test data, user should be redirected to the dashboard. That is the expected result. And last one is actual result. Actual result will be filled during the execution. So you will perform these steps. And after the step, what is the outcome? So it will be login, or if there is some issue, then it will not login. So whatever is the outcome, we should fill during the execution here. And status, it can be a pass, it can be a fail, or it can be a blocked as well. So status can be pass, status can be fail, or status can be blocked as well. If the actual result and expected result are matching, that means test case is pass. If actual result is not matching with expected result, that means test case is fail. And what is the block status? Block means, let's say you have some set of test cases. You have 4 test cases around valid login. But if valid login itself is fail, user is not able to log in due to some system error. So if you are not going to do the login, so if the login is not happening, the remaining 3 test cases which are related to login, you are not going to do that test cases, right? So you are not able to perform those test cases. So those test cases are blocked. So if you are not going to execute those test cases because of the issue in our first login test case, then those cases will be blocked state. Once the first test case issue is resolved, then you can start or you can unblock those another test cases. So that's why we should always mention block status as well. If you are not able to perform those test cases because of some issue. And now understand what is the relationship between use case, test scenario, and test case. So we have seen what is use case, we have also seen what is test scenario, and we have also seen what is test case. So use case describes how user is going to interact with the system in real world scenarios. Use cases are written by product person. Use cases are nothing but requirements. So use cases are requirements which are given by product team. Test scenario. Test scenario defines what part of the use case will be tested. So from use cases we derive the scenarios. It can be a single scenario or it can be a multiple scenario. So from the use cases we derive the test scenario. And it defines what part of the use case will be tested. What is the part we are going to test in that use case. And test case. Test case specifies exactly how each scenario will be tested. So how to test, that comes under the test case with step-by-step instructions. So if you see this diagram, from use cases we derive the test scenarios, and from test scenario, each test scenario can have single or multiple test cases. So test case is basically how to test with step-by-step actions. Test scenario derived from use cases and it defines what part of the use cases will be tested. And use cases describe how a user will interact with the system in real world scenarios. So this is the relationship between use case, test scenario and test cases. Another diagram to understand in better way. So product person will create a requirement document. That requirement document, what it will contain? It will contain the use cases. And from each use case, there can be a test scenarios. And for every scenario, we will write a different test cases. So this is the relationship between functional requirement document, or it can be called as a user story sometime. So user story will contain the requirements and use cases. From each use case, we will derive the test scenarios, and from each test scenario, we will derive the test cases. Now, let's see one sample template of test case. Let's see one sample template of test case. So this is the simple example of test case template. Now, depending on your company or organization, it might vary in some places, but I am just showing you what should be the basic details which every test case template should have. Test case ID. What is the test case ID? Test case ID is some unique identifier. For example, test case underscore 001. This is one test case identifier. So whenever you are going to write the test cases, just mention the test case ID. So test case ID will start with 001, test case 002, test case 003, test case 004, and so on. Priority of test case. So we should always give the priority to test cases. Priority means its importance. So whatever test case is very important, that comes under the P0. P0 means that exactly the functionality of the main test case. If the P0 priority is not working, that means it's a blocker issue. If the P0 test case is failed, that means it's a blocker issue. For example, valid login. If login itself is not happening, then it's a P0 issue. It's a blocker issue. So we should always give some priority to test case as per the importance. For example, P0 is highest priority. After P0, there can be a P1 test cases. After P1 test cases, there can be a P2 test cases, which are kind of a lower priority. For example, minor things like some spelling verifications, etc. That comes under the P2. Some UI like home page logo or some functional flows, that comes under the P1 priority. So this is about the priority of test case, and whenever you are going to execute the test cases, always start with P0 test cases execution, because these are most important test cases. So while writing the test cases, you will give the priority, and while the test execution, as a tester, you should always perform the P0 test cases first. Because if the P0 test cases are having issues, then it is a blocker issue. That's why we should always perform the P0 test cases. That is the priority of test cases. Next column is test scenario. So we should always provide the test scenario for that test case. So what scenario we are testing? For example, valid login, invalid login, add to cart scenario, etc. Every scenario can have multiple test cases or single test cases. If it's a valid login, then it will have some type of test case associated with it. Every scenario can have single or multiple test cases. Then comes the test type. What is the type of test we are executing? It can be a functional test case. This is a functional positive test case. Valid login means functional positive. Invalid login means functional test case, but it's a negative test case. We are going to give the negative output, negative input. We are going to provide the negative input. For example, incorrect username and incorrect password. That comes under the negative test case. That's why the test type is functional but negative. If you see, for invalid login, I can write the test cases for correct username and incorrect password, and incorrect username and correct password. So these are the different combinations. So two test cases are derived from invalid login scenario. So that's why we have mentioned it here. Test type is functional negative. Again, there is a different scenario like add to cart with single item, add to cart with multiple item. That comes under the functional positive test type. There can be a UI test cases as well. So along with the functional flows, we have to test the UI as well. What is the user interface? What is the button size, button colors, or how is the logo looking? So all this comes under the UI test cases. UI and UX test cases also testing type. After test type column, there is a preconditions. Preconditions means what is the prerequisite of that test case to perform. So If you are going to perform the valid login, then user should be registered to the system. If user is already registered to a system, then only he can perform the login, right? That is the precondition for these login steps. Again, for invalid login also, user should be registered or it might not be registered. If you are going to use the correct username, then that user should be registered. That's why the preconditions we are mentioning here. If there is a test case for adding an item to your cart, for that what are the preconditions? User should be logged in, that item should be available. That comes under the preconditions. So preconditions are nothing but the conditions which should be present before actually executing that test step for that test cases. Next comes the test steps. Test steps means sequential actions which user has to perform for that test case to execute. So if there is a login test case, so you should write the test steps in this format. Visit that login page, enter valid username, enter valid password, click on login. So these are the step-by-step guide for that test case. These are called test steps. If you want to add the item, we have written the preconditions. So to add an item in our cart on e-commerce website, if you see here, you don't have to start all the steps from the start. If you write the preconditions correctly, then you don't have to write from the start. So I am adding in preconditions that user should be already logged in and that item should be available. So these are the preconditions. So once these preconditions are satisfying, then we can click on item and click on add to cart button to add that single item. That comes under the test steps. And after performing these steps, during performing these steps, for example, test data column. What this test data column indicates? So it gives you the test data which require for testing. So for this test case, we need valid username and valid password that we can mention in the test data. For second test case, that is negative test case, for invalid login, we need invalid username and valid password. Another test case is for valid username but invalid password. So all this test data we can mention in the test data column. If you want to add some specific item in the cart, that item can be considered as a test data. That product ABC should be available, then only you can add that in the cart, right? So that comes under the test data. So test data is a input which is required for that test case. So we should have this test data column. After that, expected result. So after performing these test steps, what is the expected outcome? User should be successfully logged in. This is expected outcome. If you provide incorrect username and incorrect password, then user should not get logged in. Invalid username error message should be displayed. That comes under the expected result. An expected result, you can get it from the requirement document. If user is entering valid username but invalid password, then also user should not be able to log in. He should get invalid password error. That is the expected result. So expected result is expected outcome. What is the expected behavior after performing these steps? This is the expected result column. Actual result. So actual result is blank currently because actual result you have to fill after executing the test case. So you will enter the correct username and correct password. Then what happened? Whether the user was able to log in or some error message occurred. So whatever is the actual behavior which occurred, that we have to put in our actual result column. Actual result column is filled after the test execution. So whenever you are executing this test case, you will get some outcome that you have to put in actual result column. And if the actual result matches with the expected result, so after performing these test steps, if your user is logged in, that means expected result and actual result are matching. So you can put that actual result here. You can compare with your expected result. If both these are matching, then you will mention the status. So after matching of this expected and actual result, you can put the status as pass. If actual result is different, if user is not able to log in, then that status will be fail, because that test case is fail. So depending on your actual result, you will compare that with expected result. If actual result and expected results are matching, the test case is pass, else it is fail. That comes under the status. And if you see, for test status, we have maintaining two columns, status of QA round 1 and status of QA round 2. Now why we are maintaining two columns? So whenever you are going to do the testing, some cases will pass, some cases will fail. So whatever test cases are fail, you will report the issue for that failed test case. Developer will fix those issue and it will give you for retesting. So once the test case is fail, you will again retest those issues. And after retesting, again if the status is pass, that means issue is resolved. So you will perform the round 2 status as pass. If in round 2 again it is fail, then you have to mention that also. You can mention that fail again. And you can put the round 3 as well. So the main purpose of putting this column to indicate the retesting as well, because as a tester, we will perform some retesting on some failed test cases. So it should highlight that as well, because sometimes I have seen some people or some tester, they don't maintain this second column. So they just maintain the first round column and they will just override the test case result. So for example, if this is failed in first round, they will retest and again overwrite it as a pass. But that is incorrect. That is incorrect, because at the end of the test execution, if you are overriding the value, then at the end it will show all the test cases are passed. And that will indicate that in round 1 only all the test cases got passed. But that was incorrect. There were some issues. There were some failures in the test cases that we should highlight as well, because then only it will get highlighted that issues were present during the round 1 and for that retesting is conducted. So that's why QA status round 1 as well as QA status round 2 should be present, and we should always maintain the statuses as well. We should not change or we should not modify the test cases result afterwards. Whatever the test case result is, we should maintain it. If it is fail, then it is fail. If it is failed in round 1, if it is passed in round 2, or whether it is failed in round 2 as well, that we have to maintain. So this is about the test cases template. So you can mention or you can use such test cases template. Depending on your project, it can vary, or depending on your organization also, it can sometimes be different. But most of the cases, these are the basic details which should be part of your test cases template or test cases document. Now let's move back to our session. Now we have seen the test cases template. Now let's understand what is RTM. RTM stands for Requirement Traceability Matrix. It is a document that is used in software development and testing to ensure that all requirements are covered by test cases. So you have written the test cases, you have gone through the requirement. So every requirement or every use case will have some identifier. And for that use case, you will write some test cases. RTM document is basically mapping of those test cases with the requirement. If you see, there is a requirement ID, requirement description, and test cases ID. So which are the test cases associated with this requirement, that we have to mention in the RTM document. So ticket creation, let's take a simple scenario or simple requirement of ticket creation. For this ticket creation use case, what are the different test cases we have written? Those test cases ID we should provide here. For searching ticket, these are the test cases ID. So this is a mapping between test cases and requirement. It ensures that all the requirements are properly covered with test cases. So it helps to track the completeness of testing with respect to defined requirements. So this is called as a requirement traceability matrix document. The main purpose of this document is to ensure that every requirement is covered during the testing. Every requirement is mapped with some test cases. So that is called as a RTM document. What is the benefit of RTM? Test coverage. RTM ensures that every requirement is tested and validated. Transparency. It provides a clear view of the progress of the testing effort. Accountability. It ensures that accountability by mapping each test case to a specific requirement. It also helps to track the impact of changes in requirements on test cases. And there can be some challenges during the RTM document creation. Sometimes it can be a complex. If the project is very large, maintaining the RTM can become complex, time consuming, because nowadays SDLC and STLC are in very fast and agile process. So sometimes as a tester, we don't get enough time to create RTM document. Updating the RTM with changing requirements can be time intensive activity. It can be some overhead as well. So it can add documentation overhead in agile or rapid development environments. So these are some challenges in RTM. Now let's understand what is test suite. So what exactly is test suite? A test suite is a collection of test cases. What is test suite? Test suite is a collection of test cases designed to test a particular aspect of software application. So whenever you are writing a test cases, you can group some of the test cases in test suite. Let's say a login functionality. So login related whatever test cases you have written, you can collect and group those test cases together in a test suite. It is basically organization and grouping related to test cases to ensure that thorough testing of a specific feature, functionality, or module of the software is done properly. Test suite is basically a collection of test cases. You can create one test suite for add to cart function. You can create a test suite for all the UI test cases. You can create the test suite for login functionality. So all these test cases are grouped together in one test suite. So test suite can contain a multiple test cases which are related to specific functionality. And main benefit of test suite is it helps you to quickly identify which test cases need to be performed for any specific function related testing. For example, if you have created test suite for login functionality and tomorrow in your product something changes with the login feature, so you have to quickly test the login test cases. If you don't create the test suite, you will have to search all the login related test cases. That will become bit tedious, right? So selecting all the login related test cases, because there can be hundreds of test cases. So we should organize our test cases in a test suite. We should group our test cases. So in later stages, it becomes very easy to find out and execute specific functionality related test cases, so that you can easily identify the group test cases, right? So you will identify this is a login test suite. So it will contain all the login related test cases. So for maintenance perspective, it is very important to create a test suite and group all the test cases together. Test suite contains a set of test cases that target the same functionality or module. Each test case within a test suite focuses on different aspects such as boundary condition, edge cases, positive and negative scenarios, etc. Also, test suite allows testers to group a related test cases in organized manner, making it easier to manage and execute and track the progress of testing efforts. What are the different type of test suite we can create? So we can create a functional test suite which focuses on testing specific functionalities of a feature. Regression test suite. So during every release, if you are going to perform the regression testing, you should create one test suite with all the regression test cases. That contains the test cases to validate that recent code changes have not affected the existing functionality. So all the regression test cases you can maintain in one suite. You can also create a smoke test suite for any basic testing to verify whenever a new major function of a system working correctly before detailed testing is performed. You can also create a performance test suite, etc. So depending on your requirements, you can create a different type of test suite. So again, we have already seen example, right? So if you have checkout process, you can create a different test suite for adding items to a cart in a one test suite, applying discount code related test cases in one test suite. Another test suite you can create for completing a purchase with different payment methods. Test cases for validating billing and shipping details you can maintain in another test suite. So test suite is basically a group of test cases. A well-structured test suite ensures that all the relevant scenarios for the checkout process are covered, improving the quality of testing and reducing the risk of defect reaching to a production. So this is about the test suite. So thank you for watching this video. Let's meet in our next session.